Hi, I'm Greg Berdinger, Ghent Town historian. Today's trip into Ghent history takes us to one of Ghent's 5 new Pomeroy Foundation historical markers. This one marks the location of a meeting house, the church, shared by the Reformed Church congregation and the German Lutheran Society, 2 congregations that combined forces and finances to build a meeting house in 1816. That's 2 years before Ghent even existed. In 1816, this was actually the northeast corner of Claverack. Today, it's the intersection of Cemetery Road and Ghent-Melonville Road, also called County 9, and the property of the Ghent Union Cemetery. But let's just take a spin so you can see where we are. And so it was, in 1815, neither the Lutheran nor the Dutch Reformed congregation had the resources to build a meeting house on its own. So a joint venture was the best course forward. The 2 groups formed a committee in 1815, and in 2 newspapers published in Hudson, the committee requested building proposals for a meeting house. And shortly thereafter, they began raising money through subscriptions. Now, to choose a place for the meeting house, a vote was taken on 3 possible locations, the other 2 being a little further south along Union Turnpike, what we call Route 66 today. But they settled on this spot where the existing, probably fairly dilapidated church stood. And it's a good spot. It's within easy walking distance of what we now call Old or Lower Ghent. It's also an easy walk from the settled area around Ghent's Mills on the Kleinkill, on what we now call Arnold's Mills Road, and an easy ride along Union Turnpike from other places. In order to find what type of building would work best for the congregations, representatives visited meeting houses in Livingston to the south and Nassau to the north. And in 1816, Ephraim Baldwin was contracted to build it for the price of $4,000. A little cheaper than some churches, a little more expensive than others at the time. After some finishing touches and another $250, Baldwin's work was complete. $300 for a bell and some additional money for trimmings and a communion table. The house of worship was done. And thus, to quote the meeting minutes from 1816, the church was dedicated to the service of God. Opening prayer by the Reverend Wackerhagen, a German Lutheran minister. Sermon preached by Reverend Quitman from 133rd Psalm, 1st verse. Behold, how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. The Pomeroy Foundation, who provided the grant for this marker, insists on primary sources from the time period. A history book written in 1916 is not an adequate source for something that happened in 1816. They insist on primary sources to prove every word, number, and date on the markers. They are such sticklers for accuracy that an 1851 map, made just 5 years after the congregation split, a map showing the church right here, was not unequivocal proof that this was the exact spot the shared church stood. And that is why we have near here. Between that map and the description in the church meeting minutes, we can know for sure the church was, in fact, near here. Now, I'm 99.999% sure that it was right here. For the record, I'm glad the Pomeroy people are sticklers for accuracy. I don't mind the near here at all. If anything, it reminds me of the Pomeroy Foundation's insistence on accuracy. Thankfully, our primary source, the Ghent Reformed Church in West Ghent, still has the handwritten meeting minutes that detail every aspect of this project. Now, when I open that meeting minute book, I wasn't sure if I would find Dutch or English. Thankfully it was English, but there is a clue that Dutch was still in the air in 1815. The official resolution outlining the terms of the meeting house reads in part, "It is agreed that the gospel shall be preached in said church or meeting house in the English language by a Dutch Reformed minister at least one half of the time. The other half of the time by a German Lutheran minister. In what language, we do not know." This comes as no surprise, since Ghent's earliest white settlers were Dutch and German. Now to the last line of our marker. Site shared until 1846. The parting of the ways between the Lutheran and the Dutch Reformed first appears in the meeting minutes in 1845. It was the Reformed Dutch Church that instigated the dissolution of the agreement. They seem to have run into some resistance from the Lutherans. You can hear the near exasperation in the meeting minutes from 1845. It is resolved that a presentation be made to the Lutheran congregation of our desire to effect a separation of our joint interest in the present church edifice. The following letter is drawn up, adopted, and signed by the consistory and likewise by several others who'd been invited to attend. To the vestry of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, we, the undersigned members of the consistory and congregation of the Reformed Dutch Church, would briefly represent the following circumstance. It is known that when in the days of our fathers, the house of worship now occupied jointly by the Reformed Dutch and Lutheran congregations was erected, that both congregations were in so weak a state that neither was able to put up a separate house. But since then the size of both has been greatly increased, and the original reason for the union entirely removed, by the fact that there is sufficient means among us as well as among yourselves to attain the full ownership of the present church, or to erect another. We would also represent the fact that it's been a very long time now, and it's felt by our whole congregation to be very desirable that a separation should be effected. We are aware that the Lutheran Church has shown an unwillingness to agree to this measure, but we are so strongly convinced of its expediency that we can no longer delay in taking decided steps to bring it about. We are unwilling to have recourse to the means which the laws of the state provide for dissolving a partnership in such cases. Veiled threat. We're not going to use the law that allows us to split up with you. We would desire an agreement that might be made as to the terms of such separation without any difficulty or unpleasant feeling. We are willing to accede to any reasonable proposition which may be made on the subject and desire nothing more than any impartial person would judge to be right. We desire you would give your answer to this and express your views by Wednesday, the 9th day of July, at which time our consistory will meet in the church at 4 p.m. Interesting, isn't it? The fact they actually had to write this letter pretty strongly worded, mentioning there is a legal process that they don't want to use. They all knew each other. They were neighbors. They saw each other at the store, the blacksmith shop, maybe even the tavern, and they shared a building. Then, in a stroke of genius, the Dutch Reformed were ready for another refusal of the breakup, ready to play a clever card. At 4 p.m., the trustees of the Lutheran Church appeared and stated they were unwilling to agree to a separation, but testified they were willing to hear and take into consideration any offer or proposition which the consistory of the Reformed Dutch Church might see fit to make. Whereupon the consistory offered either to sell their interest in the church property to the Lutheran congregation for the sum of $1,100, or to give the same amount to the Lutheran interest, the party selling out to give the other a grant claim deed legally executed. Now, how about that? So the Reformed Church says, we will give you $1,100 to leave, or we'll take $1,100 and we'll leave. Clearly making very clear that that was a fair price that the Reformed were willing to take or to give. Next entry. Reverend William Dale, on the part of the Lutheran trustees, stated that they had decided to accept the offer of the Reformed Protestant Dutch Church and to sell their interest in the church edifice for the sum of $1,100. It was likewise provided the Lutheran congregation should have use of the church as heretofore until the first day of June 1846. Well played, Dutch Reformed. Well played. The Lutherans moved just a couple of hundred yards from here as the crow flies on what is now Koenig Road. Then they moved to the church itself to Main Street in Ghent in 1922. That building is now the home of a Mennonite congregation, and the Ghent Lutherans now worship with the Chatham Lutherans. The Dutch Reformed stayed here until 1870, when they moved to a new church in the new hamlet of Ghent, and after 100 years there, they merged with the West Ghent Reformed Church, and the 1870 building in the hamlet is now the home of the Bible Baptist Church. Now, if you'll just indulge me a moment here, I'd like to read you my favorite paragraph from my little book of Ghent history. One wonders if the inhabitants of Old Ghent, coming out of church in 1838 and looking across the road at the rail bed being laid, suspected what changes it would bring. Some may have seen it as progress, opening new markets for Ghent, which it did. Some may have seen it as their way out of a small farming community, which it was. Most had likely never seen a train, let alone ridden on one. No doubt some of those who had listened to Reverend Berger preach that morning eagerly awaited the rail line's contemplation, while others saw it as the serpent slipping into the garden. My point: facts are essential to the study and understanding of history. But as you enjoy Ghent's new historical markers, please let the facts engage your imagination to visualize what was once here. Think and feel what those who came before you thought and felt. It's good. It's good for your spirit. It's good for the soul to connect with those who were here before us. Many thanks to the Ghent Union Cemetery for allowing us to place the marker here, and many thanks to the William G. Pomeroy Foundation. Thank you for paying for the marker. Thank you for paying historians to review my work and for insisting on primary sources. And that's why we always say, if it says Pomeroy, you know it's right.